Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's Morbid makeup video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this craziness today, you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the unthinkable murder of 18-year-old Rachel Burkheimer. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter if you want. They're both Bratterstein, but no pressure. So now that I'm done begging you to join my cult, we can get into this video. Now this is going to be a video on a case that I have heard of before. I had definitely come upon Rachel's true crime case while I was perusing the internet. But what made me look into it fully was I had this case suggested to me by two subscribers named Sarah and Red Devil. Thank you for your suggestions. I can see why this case got to you because as I looked into it more fully, I was like, wow, this is so fucked up. This case is the stuff of actual nightmares. And if you are not familiar, which I'm sure some of you are, but if you're not, for the smallest of synopsises, Rachel Burkheimer was murdered by a group of people that she knew, a group of people that she trusted, a group of people who she thought were her friends. After watching them dig her own grave, they dug her grave while she watched it, knowing full well the entire time that the grave was intended for her. And these are people she thought were her friends. It's so horrible. With that said, today I'm going to tell you all about it, and while I do, I'm going to be putting on a full face of makeup, hence the makeup and morbid makeup. Now, if that's not really your thing, that's cool. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you find a channel that presents this case in a way you enjoy, but if you're on the fence, you're not sure how you feel, I think you should stick around, because you could be surprised by how much you like me. I'm just saying, I've been told that, you know, that people like me. I don't know. Anyways, I think it's time that we stop talking about it and just start being about it. So come, gather around and let me tell you the story of the unthinkable murder of 18-year-old Rachel Burkheimer. Rachel Rose Burkheimer is one of two daughters born to parents Denise and Bill, and she was born on January 16th, 1984 in the Snohomish County in a town called Everett in Washington. When Rachel was a baby, her family was actually worried that she may be deaf because by the age of 2.5, she still hadn't started talking. But man, were they wrong, because they found out she was just a bit of a late bloomer, and once she popped, she, quite frankly, could not stop. And she was an incredibly bubbly, friendly, funny, and engaging little girl. Her family said she was one of these girls who was a really good mimic and had a range of funny voices. Her family compared her talent to that of Jim Carrey, if that gives you any indication to the talent that she had. She had a big imagination, talking to her fingers in preschool and creating different storylines for her troll dolls. And if that's not the cutest thing you've ever heard in your life, I don't know what is. Rachel's father, Bill, said of his daughter and her spirit, and I quote, "She was so theatrical and creative. I think that's how she lived her life." I don't want to say it was fantasy, but it's kind of like she was a character from a bigger cast of some ongoing saga. Rachel was also a very skilled athlete. By the age of 6, she was already playing basketball, volleyball, soccer, and track. And this girl was so fast that her coach would make her start her sprints, her runs, 10 feet behind the other players just to make it fair. As a teenager, she made friends easily. She was just one of those people who made friends everywhere she went, on the street, at school, at work. It didn't matter. She was just that person. She was talkative and she was charismatic with a smile that could light up the room. And if anyone got mad at her, she took it as a personal challenge to try to make them like her. She was just known as being that, quote, good girl compared to her big sister, who was a little bit more of a hellraiser. Rachel's father, Bill, said of her popularity, and I quote, "She had so many social groups and such a big social network, I couldn't keep up. I was just her answering machine." He said this because Rachel's phone, like the phone in the family home. Yeah, the family phone, like the landline, was always ringing off the hook, and that it was almost always for Rachel. So she was very popular. But in addition to being very popular with her friends, she was also super close with her family. She was very close with her mom, her dad, her sister, and her niece. They often did things together. They would go to church together all of the time. And even though she was very family oriented and had a lot of friends, she was also very independent and was not the type of person to be a pushover at all. She was a very strong-willed girl. Her best friend Corey's mother said that she was a firecracker, and she was the type of person that if anyone gave her any lip, she wouldn't just sit there and take it. She would mouth right on back. She was just a very feisty girl. Rachel was a beautiful young woman at her tiny frame of 4'11", and she was the type of girl who was always dolled up, her makeup and her hair done just right, and she was always wearing 4-inch heels because she was such a teeny little thing. And in addition to being physically beautiful, she was known to be beautiful inside as well. She was the type of girl who was described as a very giving person. She's never forgot a birthday and randomly sent cards to her family and friends just to tell them that she loved them. And she even went out of her way to organize a baby shower for a coworker that she didn't even know that well. And Rachel's sister Megan said of her, and I quote, "I honestly think she was born with that incredible spirit." Rachel loved animals, particularly cats, and she had the dream of growing up to be a veterinarian. But she was also this type of girl that was incredibly ambitious, and the sky was truly the limit for her. Not even the sky. She thought she could do anything. So she also wanted to be an actress. In addition to a veterinarian, she wanted to be an actress or a medical technician. She was just very, very driven. She wanted to do so many things with her life. She thought she could do anything. She was the type of girl who would write her dreams and her ambitions and her goals that were upcoming or even further out on, like, was it a whiteboard or was it on her mirror? I think she would write them on her mirror each day, which is just like manifesting what she wanted out of life. Rachel's mother Denise said of her, and I quote, "She was just so precious, such a special person." Now, things changed for Rachel in high school when she had her first big trauma. And by first big trauma, I mean 6 huge traumas all back to back while she was in her later years of high school. And this is when 6 of her friends were killed. 6. I don't know if you've ever had any friends die during that sort of age of your life, but that kind of trauma can really, really affect a person and change a person, especially during the formative years where you are a teenager and you're just kind of figuring life out. And you find out at that time, when you're so vulnerable and so emotional already, that your life is also not guaranteed. And of course you know that, but it's different to experience it. Because I don't know which of you know out there, but I had 3 friends die when I was in that sort of age as well. 2 were murdered and 1 died in a car crash, all within the span of 1 year. And it is incredibly traumatizing. I watched my group of friends, because there was quite a few of us who were all close, deal with this sort of shock and trauma in so many different ways, and it can destroy people. There's just a humongous, heavy feeling of grief and trauma that comes with losing people in general, but especially so randomly, so unexpectedly, and at such a young age. And Rachel was experiencing this over and over 6 times with her friends dying in ways like suicide, drowning, or an accidental shooting, and this profoundly affected her. The worst of these traumas came when Rachel's very best friend Corey was killed in a really, really intense and freak car accident, and she did not deal with this well. Her and Corey were best friends. They were incredibly close. Her family described them as platonic soulmates. They were like family to each other. And when he died, she just spiraled really badly. She covered her car in photos of him. She took other photos of him and put them all up in her bedroom. She hung his obituary on the wall. Like, this was very challenging for her. And she even made it a point to stay in contact and stay friendly with his family, with his mother, with his nieces, and be a part of their lives, even though he wasn't. Corey's mom said that after Corey died, Rachel would make it a habit to check in with her, to make sure to come over to the house, to bring her gifts, like little garden trinkets of angels to watch over her. And she would make a point to always be there and present for like family gatherings, birthday parties, things like that for his nieces and nephews. Like, this was somebody who was very, very important to her. Rachel's older sister Megan said of this trauma and the impact it had on Rachel, and I quote, "It was so hard. I think it killed her, literally. She just became so heartbroken. You could see it in her eyes. Her light was gone." After losing Corey, that sparkle, that thing that made Rachel Rachel, started to disappear, and her family could see that she was going down a dark path. They were watching it happen, seeing her kind of deteriorate right before their eyes, but they couldn't do anything to help her. Rachel just changed. She ended up quitting her job. She ended up switching from her public high school to a continuation school to try to continue, but ended up just dropping out of school altogether because it just wasn't something that she could prioritize at that time. She started just getting withdrawn. She started sleeping all day and staying up all night, and her family did what they could to try to help her, to try to talk to her. They even took her to a therapist, but nothing they were doing seemed to be helping her. Her father, Bill, said of this time, and I quote, "She was in a lot of depression, emotional turmoil. She just seemed to be in a real downward spiral, which was really uncharacteristic." The Rachel who was previously so ambitious and so goal oriented and driven, who even wrote, her goals for the day, her ambitions and all of that on her mirror and on the dry erase board above her bed, had just completely lost herself. She had no interest in doing anything. She was going down this dark path of depression, and she started using cocaine and meth. Rachel's sister Megan said this was just happening right before their eyes and she couldn't do anything about it, that the Rachel that they knew was just completely disappearing, that her level of joy was deteriorating, that all of her priorities were just going right out the window, and she was becoming a shell of the person she actually was, and her character was just disappearing. The deeper she fell into her depression, the more she used drugs, and the more she used drugs, the more she drifted away from her family. And as I said, she had quit going to school, and once she quit going to school, she had more time to use drugs. And the more she did this, the more she started making new friends, people she was meeting in this sort of mindset. And these people that she started hanging out with were not the best people to try to be useful in helping her deal with what she was going through. They were more the type of people that were going to help her drift farther and farther away from who she really was, and things that could actually help her get out of her depression. Instead, she was just going to be drowning herself in drugs and hanging out with some shadier individuals. Now, of these new friends that Rachel would meet that would definitely send her life down a completely different path than the life she had been living previously, was a man named John Anderson. John Anderson, who went by the nickname of Diggy because toughness, was the leader of a small up-and-coming street gang called the Northwest Mafia, and he was a dangerous guy. He had a short temper and was known to always have guns on him. John and his friends, his fellow mafia members, would deal a little bit with drugs, and they were definitely the type of dudes who dipped into their own supply. They were party animals. They would just sit at home, smoke weed, do coke and meth, and play video games. So Rachel's family knew that she was going down a darker path and that she had been spending some time with some weens. But they did not know about John specifically, and they did not know about him and his friends and the connection with the Northwest Mafia. Her dad ended up finding out about this because one day he went out to his mailbox, he got his mail, he's opening up his mail and he finds a phone bill. And when he opens it, he's like, what the fuck? Because he sees on his bill, on the record, that Rachel had been making calls to somebody in jail, accepting the charges, and he had a bill of $600. Now apparently, John had, because he spent some time in jail, had been in jail, and during this time, he and Rachel had been having a long-distance relationship since he was in jail, and the two had been talking the whole time he had been in there. In addition to all the countless phone calls, they were also writing a ridiculous number of letters to each other. And one of the letters from John to Rachel said, and I quote, "If you're wondering why I sent you all the flowers, it's because you are just as unique and as beautiful as each one, and I don't know any other way of showing you that you are so special to me. I would murder 1,000,000 people if I had to, just to be with you. I'm so in love with you. I sometimes wonder if love is the right word." Upon learning that Rachel was talking to this guy in jail, obviously her family was not about it, and they were worried about her, and her dad actually confronted her about it because of the phone bill and everything. And when he talked to her about it, she just stood up for him and for the relationship and was like, you know, Daddy, you don't know him. No, you don't know him like I know him. He's actually a good guy deep down. He's just misunderstood, and we really care about each other. Rachel had met John at a house party in the spring of 2001, and when she met him, some of her older friends, some of the people who had known her previously, warned her that she might want to stay away from him because he was known as being a bit of a dangerous guy, and he had been in and out of jail on charges for burglary, robbery, drug charges, among other things. And her dad, once he learned about him, even though Rachel told him oh, he's more than you think, blah, 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 her dad still wasn't into it and told her that once he got out, he still was not welcome in their home. Sorry, but I'm not sorry. He's not coming over here. The problem was that Rachel was basically an adult. She had her own car. She had her own life. So her dad couldn't really stop her from going and seeing him. He could voice his opinions and his concerns, but that was pretty much the extent of what he could do at this point. And her sister Megan just thought, this was her bad boy. Every girl has to date a bad boy, and this is hers. This is just a phase that she's going through. But unfortunately, Rachel never got a chance to get over this phase because she chose the worst bad boy for her that there possibly could be. Rachel's sister said of Rachel's infatuation with John Anderson, and I quote, "She was intrigued by him in some way. I think he just kept pursuing her. And every girl dates a bad boy once in her life, and he was hers." The pair dated for several months, but eventually Rachel stopped talking to him, had kind of cut him off, stopped returning his phone calls, stopped returning his letters. And once she did that, he did not let it go. He continued to pursue her. And in some jailhouse letters he wrote to her in December of 2001, he wrote over and over about how much he loved her, how he wanted her to give him another chance. They discussed marriage, and in one letter he wrote, "I love you," 33 times across the page to her. So, he got a taste of something he liked, and he would not stop. Got a taste of something he likes. I don't know if I like that choice of words. He wrote to Rachel saying, quote, "You are my world. You are my everything. You make my heart beat. You make me function, and you also make me think. I don't think I could or would ever want to live without your love. The only reason I do these things is because I don't want to lose you. I am obsessed with your love and you in general. I just don't know what to do sometimes when we get in arguments. I just want us to be perfect." John was obsessive and aggressive and jealous and possessive. And once he got out of jail and the two could be together, he got so much worse. He would literally smell Rachel. Okay, if she had been away from him for a period of time, he would literally smell her hair. He would smell her clothes, looking for some sort of sign that she had been with other dudes. Okay? And shortly thereafter, she would start showing up with fresh bruises, fresh cuts, fresh injuries that could not be explained, but she stuck around. And it's so sad to see this. We see this so often, and it's hard to get out of these abusive relationships. And she was so young and had been through so much and had lost so much that I can't even imagine how important this relationship was to her. And it sucks because he clearly wasn't treating her well. Knowing where the story goes, this is the worst thing she could ever have gotten involved in. And it just sucks that people accept the love they think they deserve as opposed to the love they do deserve, because she deserved so much better than this piece of shit was giving her. Rachel's sister Megan saw these bruises at some point and was like, "Bro, what the fuck? Why are you still with this guy?" And she and Rachel ended up having a really long talk. They had a really long heart-to-heart where they sat in Megan's room till 2 o'clock in the morning just talking about everything. And at the end of this, Rachel decided that she wanted to end things with John, that she was over it. She was tired of his jealousy. She was tired of his possessiveness. She was tired of the way he would hurt and threaten her. And she decided that she actually was just going to fully cut him off. It was after this that Rachel's family noticed another big change in her, but this time it was for the positive. It seemed like she was becoming her old self again, and they were just seeing such a huge improvement in her. She seemed like her old self. She started engaging with her family again and spending time with them, going to church again, and reuniting with old friends. Her sister ended up finding a to-do list that she had written, and of these things she wanted to do, it included things like reestablishing connections with, quote, positive friends. And she was trying to do just that. She had reconnected with an old high school friend of hers named Allie. This is one of her eldest friends. And the two had just lost touch, and she was trying to reconnect. This friend Allie said of this rekindling with Rachel, and I quote, "The last couple of weeks before she died, we were talking almost every other day. She kept saying, 'I love you, and it's time for us to hang out again.'" During this time, Rachel had also made time to make some new friends, or at least some newish friends. Rachel told her dad that she had met a new man. This was a man named Maurice Rivas. And Maurice was also a member of the Northwest Mafia. But like Rachel, he wanted to get out of that lifestyle. He wanted to get out, change his life, do some things for the better, reinvent himself. Or at least this is what he had been telling Rachel. Maurice Rivas was 18 years old, and he had had a pretty rough start to life. He had grown up in foster care for most of his formative years, and as an adult, his only, close-ish relative was a grandmother. Like Rachel, he had gone down a rough path, and once the two met, they started trying to, bring out the best in each other. And they had made a pact to leave the life, go back to school, graduate, and walk with their classes. Rachel said that her and Maurice had the plan to get jobs and to really be there for each other and to take care of each other. And her dad, Rachel's dad, was so into it. He was like, "I don't know this guy, never met this guy, but anyone who can inspire her to come back to us, I am into it, I'm for it, I approve of this gentleman." Her dad said of this time and of these plans that Rachel had made, and I quote, "She was just pumped. She was just beaming. She was like, I've got a plan. I'm gonna do this right. No more alternative school. No more GED." Now, I know that this, at least when I was first hearing it, I was like, oh, this sounds romantic. This sounds like somebody she's having a little relationship with. But apparently it wasn't. Apparently this was a very platonic friendship. And unfortunately that left Rachel single, which left her open to rekindle her relationship with John Anderson. Unfortunately. So the two did just that. They rekindled their relationship, but it wasn't as strong as it had been once before. It was very on again, off again. And during one of these off again periods, Rachel went on a date with another man. But this was a man who was friends with John. And apparently Rachel thought that it was nothing. It was no big deal. It was very, a non-issue. But to John Anderson, this was a big issue. Now, what happened next gets a little bit sticky now. Whether this is something that John Anderson really believed or something that he made up in his mind because he did drugs and did meth, I'm not sure. But either way, John got it in his head that Rachel was essentially a narc and was divulging gang secrets to a rival gang in the area. Apparently there were two other rival small gangs in this area, and Rachel was friends with people in these gangs. Okay, she was friends with the guys in John Anderson's gang, but she was also friendly with the guys in this other gang. And this made John and his friends, his fellow gang members, nervous. Now, is this true? I really couldn't find out. I couldn't find out if she really was friends with them or if this is just something that they thought. But apparently they told her, you need to pick a side, you need to stick to one group or whatever. And they didn't trust her and they didn't think that she had done that. And it was so dumb because these guys really got it in her head that she was betraying them. And at one point she had even invited some of the Northwest Mafia men over to a hotel to party. And they really thought that this meeting was either a sting by the police or a setup with the rival gang to get them, I don't know, hurt or jumped or something. So they were really, really not trusting Rachel at this point. And I don't think, my gut is that it was unfounded and that John Anderson was just super pissed off that he couldn't have Rachel, he couldn't control Rachel, that she was not being his property anymore and that he was putting things in people's head. Or maybe it was the fact that he was on drugs and he was just like going cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, didn't know what was going on and was making stuff up in his paranoid state. I'm not sure, but either way, he got all these guys in his gang thinking that she was a rat. And that rat needed to be brought into the light. I just watched the new Batman. It's not new when you guys are watching this video, but it's new at the time that I'm filming this video. So around this time, Rachel got the word that there was actually a hit out on her. And reasonably, she freaked the fuck out and she went to her sister Megan for advice. And once Megan heard all the details, she didn't really take it seriously. She didn't take John Anderson seriously as like a real gangster, a real threat. And she thought he was just some young, dumb punk. So she told her sister, like, okay, just be aware of your surroundings, pay attention, try not to worry, but definitely stay away from John at all costs, because clearly this is trouble. And when Rachel left Megan's room that night, Megan remembers having just like a little flash, a little blip in her mind where she thought to herself, like, could this be true? Could this be a real issue? But she kind of shook it out of her mind thinking like, no, there's no way. It's impossible. Now, Rachel did not heed her sister's warning, unfortunately. And on September 23rd, 2002, she went to a house party with several of her friends. These were 7 members of the North Mafia. One of these 7 men that was in attendance was Maurice Rivas, her new friend that she had been bonding with, the new friend who was supposed to be there for her, the one who was leaving the life and starting over, and just her support system, right? So she felt safe, and plus she wanted to go regardless because she wanted to show her friends, these men who she thought were her friends, that she wasn't a snitch, that there was nothing going on, that she could be trusted, and she wanted them to know that, and thought her being there and showing them that she was still cool with them would show them that she was one of them and she was in with them and she would never ever betray them. The night started out normally. Rachel and the group of men were all just hanging out, drinking, smoking weed, playing games, playing video games, being totally normal. Nothing out of the ordinary. That was until John Anderson showed up at the party. He was pissed. He was not happy to see them all hanging out, having seemingly such a good time. He was not happy to see them all so happy and accepting of Rachel. She had betrayed them, and by extension, them hanging out with her, they were now betraying him. Or so it would seem. He walked in and even slapped a few of these guys in the face. Such a bitch move. And he pulled out a gun. And from there, other people pulled out guns. And things got very intense. So Rachel got up and she tried to leave. But she was about to find out that she was not going to leave. She was never going to get to go home again. Because she had just walked into a trap. This whole thing was planned. Apparently they had even actually planned to kidnap Rachel earlier in the day. They had planned in the early afternoon to invite Rachel over to one of the gang members' homes. This was a young man named Nathan Lovelace, and they were going to invite her over to his home. And before she got there, John Anderson was going to back a vehicle into the garage so that when Rachel showed up, they could kidnap her and take her to another location. But this ended up not working, and the plan was foiled because Nathan's dad came home and they weren't expecting him to be home, and obviously they could not kidnap and potentially murder a young girl while dad was home. Like, that would be in bad taste. Dad probably wouldn't like that. So John Anderson was like, okay, this didn't work. So what you guys need to do is you need to get her to this duplex, which is where the house party was happening. And you need to make sure she's there. And if you don't, I'm going to put some of you in the coffins. Anyways, as Rachel tried to flee from the house, her ex-boyfriend, John Anderson, grabbed her by the hair, hit her in the face, and knocked her to the ground, where he started to kick her. And it's at that moment that other men, the men she had been spending time with, hanging out with, her friends this whole time, started to kick her as well. They kicked her over and over. They kicked her in the head. Okay? And at one point, one of the men even turned the music up louder to drown out the sound of her screams. Once Rachel was sufficiently beaten, the men then took her and dragged her out to the garage, where they bound her with tape and gagged her, and then left her on the cold floor of the garage while they went back inside to decide what they were going to do next. One of the men, this was a man named Yusuf, was pretty pissed off by this because this was his home and his girlfriend's home, and this was not supposed to take place in his house, so he was pretty pissed off that this was happening. He was the eldest of the group, I believe, And he was also one of the leaders, and this was not supposed to take place in this duplex. Inside, the men discussed ransom. Would her dad have the money to pay to get her back? They discussed gang rape. They discussed even taking her to a hotel to heal up, but they couldn't make up a decision. So instead, they ordered pizza, they played more video games, and did a bunch more drugs, all while Rachel lay on the garage floor, cold, alone, and scared. At one point, Rachel must have thought that she was being saved because the woman who owned the duplex, who rented the duplex, I'm not sure if she owned it or if she rented it, Yusef's girlfriend, came home. This was a girl named Trissa Connor. And she came home and entered through the garage to find Rachel bound and gagged with duct tape on her garage floor. And she saw it and she's like, what the fuck? And she freaked out and she ran into the house to retrieve a knife before going back to the garage to try to cut Rachel free. At this point, John Anderson, who, I guess saw her inside the house getting the knife, ran out and tried to stop her from saving Rachel, and the two got into a screaming match, which eventually led to Trissa telling them, fine, get her the fuck out of here. This is not happening in my house. Get out of here. I'm going to call the cops. But she never actually did call the cops. It was at this point that the men took Rachel, all bound and gagged, and stuffed her into a duffel bag. And since Rachel was only 4'11" and very, very thin, this wasn't difficult for them to do. They then took her to the Jeep. It was a vehicle owned by one of the men, a man named Matthew Duran, and they shoved Rachel in the duffel bag in the back of this Jeep. This is when 4 of the men who had been present got into the Jeep. It was John Anderson, Maurice Rivas, Rachel's good friend, Matthew Duran, the man who owned the Jeep, and a man named John Whitaker. They all got in this Jeep and they just began driving. The group drove around for hours trying to figure out what they wanted to do before finally making the decision to drive to an area near Gold Bar, which was up in the mountains. They had finally made their decision on what they were going to do, and they had decided that they were going to murder 18-year-old Rachel Burkheimer. Once they get to the mountains, the men decide that they're going to need supplies, which they had not brought. So this is when John Anderson and the other 2 men, John Whitaker and Matthew Duran, get back in the Jeep and head back into town to get things they're going to need, shovels, things they're going to need for the murder and impending burial. Leaving who to stand over and watch Rachel? Her good friend, Maurice Rivas. They left him alone with her while they went to get supplies. Her good friend, the one who promised to be there for her, now stood above her while she laid on the ground, beaten and bloody, waiting to be murdered in the mountains. And does he do anything to help her? No. He sits there and watches her as she begs and she pleads for him to let her go, for him to help her. And then finally she gets to the point where she's like, okay, if this is going to happen to me, please at least don't let them drown me, because that was her biggest fear. And he hears all of this and he's like, I don't think it's going to come to that. And he does not let her go. Once the group of men get back, they put Rachel back in the back of the Jeep. They pull out the shovels that they had brought and they start to dig. And at this point, Rachel is freaking out reasonably and she's making a lot of noise. So the men pull the duffel bag back from the Jeep and lay it on the ground. And John Anderson takes his shovel and hits the side of the bag as hard as he can to stop her from making noise. So now Rachel's laying on the ground, looking through a little opening in the duffel bag and watching these men dig her grave. Her ex-boyfriend, who apparently loved her so much, he had to write I love you 33 times on a letter he wrote to her. Her good friend, who was going to protect her and restart his life independent of this gang with her. All these men who she spent all this time with were now digging her grave and she was watching it happen. That's just like the most horrifying thing I can imagine going through. Once the men were done digging the grave, they pulled her from the bag and they tried to take her clothes off. And she fought them on this and finally was like, you know what, fine, fuck it, I'll do it myself. So she strips. And it's at this point that they tell her to climb into the grave. And once in there, she starts to freak out and pray. And they take her jewelry. They start taking her jewelry. Her rings, her necklaces, everything that she was wearing that day. And once they get to a certain ring, she starts to cry and she begs to keep this one ring, just this one ring. And it was a ring that her best friend Corey had given her, the one who had died in a car crash. It was a ring that he had given to her before he died, and she wanted to be able to be wearing this when she died. But John Anderson was not interested in showing her any mercy, and he took this ring from her as well, telling her not to worry because she would be with Corey soon enough. John Anderson then ordered Rachel to get face down in her grave, and she knelt down and put her hands together to pray. And it's at this point that her ex-boyfriend, John Anderson, unloaded an entire clip into the back of Rachel, shooting her over and over in her back and in the back of her head. And at one point, the gun ended up jamming, so he had to stop, fix this, and once he fixed it, he proceeded to unload the rest of the clip into her body. The men then left and started driving home, and on the way, John Anderson told his crew that any loose ends would be cut off, essentially threatening the men that if anyone is to say anything, they would be the next ones killed. The men then took measures to try to cover their tracks. They drove Rachel's vehicle, which had been left at the duplex. They drove that over to the home of one of her ex-boyfriends and left it there in hopes to frame him for the crime. They then took a pillowcase filled with Rachel's belongings, her clothes, her jewelry, and they set it on fire before disposing of it. When Rachel did not return home, her family immediately called the police and reported her missing because they just knew right off the bat that something was wrong. This was very unlike her, and they knew that something bad must have happened. So they reported her missing, and then they went into full search mode. They posted flyers of her everywhere, like missing persons flyers everywhere, and they started contacting media outlets trying to get as much exposure as they possibly could to Rachel and her case. Her dad said of her disappearance in the early days, and I quote, "All we know is Rachel would not be away this long without contacting someone. And we do know that wherever she is not there by choice." Now, the first credible tip ended up coming to police when the mother of one of the men who had been at the house party that night called the police and called in a tip. This was the mother of a young man named Jeffrey Barton. And I'm not sure what Jeffrey said to his mother or what his mother said to police. But from her call, police were led to a red Jeep, the same Jeep that had been used to transport Rachel to the mountains the night she was murdered. So from there, police bring in Matthew Durham, the owner of the Jeep. Remember, we talked about him. And they bring him in to question him, and at first he's not giving away anything. But with some pressure, he does end up breaking. Police tell him, like, listen, you're the only one who can help this family, who can bring some closure to this case and give this family some peace. And somehow they're able to appeal to him. And he tells them, like, I got caught up in some things I'm not proud of. And he agrees to take police to Rachel's burial site. So he leads police to the area where Rachel was killed and buried, and he can't remember the exact site of where she was killed and buried, but he has the general area down for them. So police come and they search this area for 2 days. They even bring in cadaver dogs to try to like sniff her out. And finally they do find her 10 days after she was murdered. Once police found the area that Rachel was buried, it did not take long for them to recover her. Apparently she was buried in such a shallow grave that it only took one scoop of earth from a shovel to uncover her remains. And once they did uncover her and they pulled her from the grave, there was a perfect indentation from her hands being clasped together in prayer in the dirt. And her father, Rachel's father, later said that this fact brought him some sort of peace. I guess whatever brings you peace in a situation like this, but fuck. Prior to this, her family had tried to stay positive and tried to have hope that she was still alive out there, but her mother said that she didn't really have that hope because she just knew in her gut that her daughter was gone. And she said of this, and I quote, "I just knew it. I could feel her presence was gone." After Rachel's body was recovered, police went back to Matthew Durham and they're like, okay, listen, bro, we have her body. Shit's fucking serious. You need to tell us who the other men were who were involved. And I can only imagine that at this point, Matthew was like, shit, dude, like, this is all going to get pinned on me. He just, self-preservation must have kicked in because he told police the name of the 3 other men who had been there that night. He told him it was John Anderson, Maurice Rivas, and John Whitaker. And he also told police all the names of all the men who had been at the house party, who knew what was happening, who had taken part in her beating, and or who had just been there and had done nothing to help her. From there, with the suspects named and the story told, police went to the duplex to try to recover as much evidence as they could. They recovered a bunch of evidence from the gravesite and also from a nearby pond. They just had so much physical evidence in this case. They found bullet casings at the gravesite that matched a gun that was recovered from the pond and was conclusively determined to be the gun that was used to kill Rachel. They also found duct tape and Rachel's missing jewelry. They had clothes that had been worn at the time of the murder that had been partially burned, and they also had these shovels used to dig Rachel's grave. Police then went and arrested the remaining 7 men who either took part in the murder or were complicit in the murder of Rachel Burkheimer. And these 8 men who were arrested in total are as follows. 20-year-old John Anderson, who was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and he was up for the death penalty if convicted. 22-year-old John Whitaker, who was also charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and he was also up for the death penalty if convicted. 32-year-old Yusuf Jihad, who was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. 22-year-old Jeffrey Barth, who was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. 20-year-old Tony Williams, who was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace, who was charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree kidnapping and first-degree rendering criminal assistance. 17-year-old Matthew Durham, who was charged with first-degree murder. And last, 18-year-old Maurice Rivas, who was charged with first-degree murder. Rachel's mother, Denise, said of this time and these arrests, and I quote, "She was missing for 10 days, and it went on and on. Arresting different, 2 of them, 3 of them, 2 more. It just went on and on. It was a nightmare. It was surreal." 5 of these men who were arrested ended up making plea deals for lesser sentences, and in exchange they would testify against the 3 remaining men, who were John Anderson, who was thought to be the triggerman, John Whitaker, who helped dig Rachel's grave, and Yusuf Jihad, who helped come up with the plan in the first place. Due to their plea deals, the other men received the following sentences. Nathan Lovelace, whose house Rachel was initially supposed to be kidnapped from, received 30 days. Tony Williams, who provided the duct tape to bind Rachel and turned up the stereo to drown out her cries, received 9 years. Jeffrey Barth, who was present when Rachel was being held in the garage and hit her with the barrel of his gun, received 10 years. And both Matthew Durham, who helped kidnap Rachel and drove the Jeep where Rachel would be murdered, knowing that she would be killed, and Maurice Rivas, who helped kidnap Rachel, stand watch over her while the others left, helped dig her grave, and helped bury her. Well, both of these guys received 26 years. During the opening statements of John Anderson's murder trial, his attorney tried to say that essentially the prosecution's case was weak and that they didn't have any evidence that proved that his client was guilty, and all they had was the testimony of a bunch of dudes who were just trying to get lighter sentences. But the prosecution did have a good amount of evidence against John Anderson, and they also had character witnesses and people who said different things that they had seen. One man even said that he had heard and seen John Anderson go into a rage where he threatened to murder Rachel, saying he would snap her neck because she wouldn't get back with him. Rachel's poor family had to sit through hours and hours of testimony hearing about Rachel's final moments, what these men did to her, what they talked about doing to her. And apparently during the trial, John Anderson was really, really smug, and he would often smile and wink at her family. During the trial, Rachel's sister Megan identified 4 rings that had been recovered. I believe they were recovered from the pond, if I remember correctly. And of these 4 rings, there were 2 silver bands, 1 ring that had little turtles on it, and 1 ring that was the one that had been Corey's, that had been given to Rachel, the one that she had begged to be buried with when she was killed. In the end, John Anderson was given life in prison for his part in the crime. John Whitaker was also given life in prison for his part in the crime, and Yusuf Jihad was given 37 years in prison for his part in the crime. Rachel's father, Bill, said of this moment, and I quote, "This is not a moment of celebration for us. It's a victory, but it's a loss all at the same time. It's really hard to explain. It's really hard to put into words. So Crime Watch Daily actually did an episode on this case, which I did watch in preparation for this case because, you know, they interview family and things like that. And they did reach out to John Anderson and they wanted to speak to him, obviously, since he was like the muscle behind all of this happening. And they wanted to try to understand how this happened and how so many people who were friends with Rachel could all fail her at the same time. But he declined to be interviewed. He said that at the time he was working on an appeal and he couldn't meet with them until he had kind of seen how that played out, so it wouldn't affect that. But he wanted to let them know that, you know, he's a changed man. He's not the same monster he was when Rachel was killed, and he's doing all he can to better his life and turn his situation around and blah, blah, blah. Rachel's dad, Bill, believes that John Anderson murdered Rachel because she was one of the few people that he couldn't control. And he doesn't think that jealousy is the only motive for him to murder her. But I don't know what else would have been, and I didn't find clarity on what he meant by that. But that he thought that it was because he couldn't control her, for one, and that there was something else to it besides just the jealousy. As for Maurice, Rachel's good friend, the one who was supposed to be there for her, but the one that actually ended up helping murder her and didn't help her escape when he had the chance, he said of the murder in a jailhouse interview, and I quote, "It was really senseless and it didn't need to happen. And it was just a horrible, horrible thing." He continued saying, quote, "A lot of it was fear that kept gripping me. That I was like, man, I was just really scared in a lot of points. I know that's like cowardice and I failed on an epic scale." That, I think, is a bit of an understatement. But thanks for taking responsibility, Maurice Rivas. John Whitaker, the other man who got life in prison for helping dig Rachel's grave, stealing her jewelry, and helping bury her, he did actually try to get released. He ended up actually getting a new trial, but when the new trial went through, when it was heard, he was found guilty again. And he tried to appeal this in 2018, but this appeal was denied. Bill, Rachel's father, said of John Whitaker, and I quote, "No amount of dirt and rocks he threw on Rachel's body, no amount of burning and bleaching of evidence would ever hide his guilt." Rachel's father decided to turn his grief into action, and he started working on legislation to make it a crime to not render aid to an injured person. So he was one of those people that we talk about all the time here that tries to turn their trauma into something good. And as I've always stated, and I'll say it 1,000 times, especially if you binge my videos, you'll hear me say this 1,000 times, and it's an incredibly brave thing to do that I don't think I would be so brave and so big to do. So hats off to Bill Burkheimer. And now I want to end this video with a quote from Rachel's mother, and that's because to read it kind of broke my heart into a million pieces a little bit. And that is, she said of her daughter, and I quote, "Rachel has always been in my heart. She was my baby, and I have all of my memories." And with that quote, that, my friends, is the story of the horrible murder of 18-year-old Rachel Burkheimer. Isn't that just one of the worst things you've ever heard in your entire life? This case is so up. I cannot imagine being in Rachel's position. I can't imagine how fucking terrified she felt and how betrayed she felt, and to just lay there and watch that happen. It's like it's too much to process mentally that this was a real thing that happened, but it was. This poor girl was killed this way, and her poor family had to know that. They had to know that her final moments on earth were filled with pain and absolute terror, and that's so messed up because you can't unlearn that, you know that information, you have to live with that information on you for the rest of your life. And it's so sad, and this murder was just so pointless. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and I hope it gave you all of the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I want to thank you for remembering Rachel with me today. What happened to her is so horrible, and at such a young age and after so much trauma. It really seems like she wanted to get back on track. Like she had gone through her grieving process and she was seeing what was happening, and she wanted to do something better and to improve her situation and improve her life. But she was robbed of that experience and of trying to get it together. And from seeing firsthand what trauma like this can do to a person and the type of spiral you can go down, it's possible that she could have improved her situation, but she wasn't given the chance, and her family wasn't given the chance to see her see that improvement. And that's just really sad. But again, anyways, let me know down below of any cases you want to see me cover in the future. As you know, I have a long list of cases, and as this one indicates, if you leave me a case suggestion, if I get to it, I'm going to put your name next to the suggestion, because I want to look into the cases you suggest, because you're filled with good ideas and good taste. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. If you haven't already, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically. You, and if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below for you, along with a link to my merch store, which I'm not wearing my merch. This is actually my friend's merch. I could put a link to my friend's merch store too, maybe, if I remember. And there's also a list of all the makeup that I've used today, and nail polish, earrings, all that jazz. Everything is always linked down below for your pleasure, so that you can have the pleasure. And you know what? I think that's it. I think I've said all the things I need to say. I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday. And I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.